since there's so much overlap between the patriarchal, Mosaic, and the Christian dispensations, much of what we've been studying, virtually all of it, in fact, relates to us today. We're going to look, however, a little bit just at the patriarchal law itself. There are three basic laws that God has had: the patriarchal law, the law of Moses, and then the law of Christ in the New Testament. We're going to be looking at when did the patriarchal law end as we study our Bibles. Now, we'll look at several passages and lay this out. The law of Moses ended at the cross. The scriptures tell us that in Colossians 2, verses 13 through 15, and also in Ephesians. We'll look there too. So we'll be looking at that. Daniel himself, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, prophesied that Messiah, which would be Christ, would make his covenant, that is the New Testament, with the Jews for a 7-year period of time. In this 7-year period, in the middle of that period, Messiah would be cut off. He would be crucified. So we've always taught that his personal ministry lasted 3.5 years. And when we put the chronology together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see that it's between 3 and 4 years. We can't get it any closer than that, between 3 and 4. But the prophet Daniel said 3.5. So that fits what we see in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then, of course, he's going to make this covenant for 7 years, but he's crucified after 3.5. So for 3.5 more years, he's making his covenant with the Jews. We'll lay this out and show how that fits in with the end of the patriarchal law. Now, we'll be looking at that. When did the patriarchal law end? The law of Moses ended at the cross, but that's not the patriarchal law. If we look at this passage in Colossians 2, verse 13 and following, and you, being dead through your trespass and the uncircumcision of your flesh. Now, he's talking, obviously, about Gentile converts because of the uncircumcision of your flesh. That's just a way of saying you're Gentiles. So he said here, you were dead through your sins, your trespasses. You obviously had sinned, and the uncircumcision of your flesh. You, I say, did he make alive, so you Gentile Christians were made alive. And you said, did he make alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses? So the word having forgiven is a participle explaining how they were made alive. Because once they're made alive by being forgiven of their trespasses, their sins. Now, trespass is a violation of a law. That's the word for trespass. It's another word for sin. It's another way of looking at sin. The normal word for sin is to miss a mark, like you're hitting at a bullseye, shooting a bow and arrow at a bullseye, and you miss it. And so that's another word for sin. And there's another word for sin where you trespass, you go where you shouldn't have been. So sin is depicted in several different ways, but this way here is the violation of a law. So your trespasses, you're forgiven of your sins. Having blotted out the bond written in ordinances. So the bond written in ordinances in this context is the law of Moses. So the bond written in ordinances was blotted out. Now, the blotting out could be something like erasing of something or ending it. And so here now, blotting out the bond written in ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he hath taken it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. So in effect, the law of Moses was nailed to the cross. So we see when it ended. It ended at that time. It was taken out of the way at the cross. Having despoiled the principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. So in his crucifixion, he triumphed. The world saw it as a loss. Satan thought he had won, and he actually lost, because Jesus then was a fit sacrifice, and he had no sin, and so he was a sacrifice and made atonement for our sins at that time. The law of Moses, however, if we look in Ephesians 2, Now, if you study Ephesians and Colossians and put them side by side, put two Bibles together, lay them side by side, you can see something very interesting. Those two books are parallel in structure. They talk about the same material. One of them talks about the Christ of the church, and the other one talks about the church of Christ, his church or him. And they're looking at it from a different angle. So the law of Moses was a middle law partition. It was a partition wall. Now, I remember when I was younger, him talk about put a partition wall into a building of some sort. So you're partitioning it off, separating it out. So a wall is put in to separate. In Ephesians 2:13, Paul writes, "But now in Christ Jesus, ye that once were far off." Well, now who is that was afar off? Well, it's the Gentiles. So you who were once afar off, you Gentiles, you are now made nigh in or by the blood of Christ. Now, the word translated in is frequently translated by. The King James frequently does that, and the Greek will allow either translation. I think by is probably better, but it's by means of the blood of Christ that they were made nigh. You Gentiles were afar off, now you're brought near by the blood of Christ. For, now he's going to explain it, he is our peace. He is our peace, who made both one. Now, peace in what sense? Well, there's peace in two senses in the context. There's peace between God and man, and that's the peace we're looking for. And there was peace between Jew and Gentile. Formerly, they'd been at odds with one another, at variance. The wall of partition, the law of Moses, separated them. For he is our peace, so he made peace, who made both one, both Jew and Gentile one. So the peace here in this context, I think, is peace between Jew and Gentile. But there has to be peace with God first for there to be peace with Jew and Gentile. And break down the middle wall of partition. A partition wall was between the Jew and Gentile. Now, when we look at this, we see the temple complex. I'll try to use my mouse here. Here's your partition wall, right across here. And there's the partition wall. The Gentiles could stay out here, and a Jew who hadn't cleansed himself could stay out here. But only Jews who had cleansed themselves could go into here, into this region. So that's your partition wall right here. Now, they've dug this up, and archaeologists have found the partition wall. And so it's soreg, it's a low lattice screen, but it's a railing. Now, then this partition wall had warning signs in a state of sense. There were warning blocks of stones with carving on them, writing on it. This is in Greek. And it tells them not, the first two letters are not. It tells the Gentiles not to go beyond this point, or you're going to be responsible for your own death. The Romans had given the Jews permission to put people to death who went beyond that point. And so that's one thing they could put you to death for. And so a Gentile could not go beyond that point. And so this reads in Greek, this is Greek. And so what we have here is they're instructed not to do this. And so this is a stone. They found several of these stones. They were written in 3 languages. They were written in Greek, Latin, and in Hebrew, all 3 languages. So they were written in 3 languages, these stones were. And so it tells them don't go beyond there. This last word here is thanaton, that's death. You're responsible for your own death. So it's a warning. And so that was a partition wall, a wall of partition between them, separating them. You can't go worship together. You can't worship with each other. That partition wall separated them. So that wall of partition was taken out of the way by Jesus. He goes back, let's go back to Ephesians 2:15. Having abolished in the flesh the enmity. The enmity, that enmity was caused by the separation, the law of Moses. And remember, everybody was under the Patriarchal Law until Mount Sinai. The Jews are now separated off into a separate system. And that was only for them. And the Gentiles continued under the Patriarchal Law. Now, abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, that he might create in himself of the two, that is the two, Jew and Gentile, one new man, so making peace. So now Jew and Gentile are brought together in the church. In the Lord's church, there is no such thing as a distinction based upon race. It doesn't exist. In the church as God ordained it. Now, I realize there's sometimes people who are racist in their thinking, but there is no racial distinction in the church between any race whatsoever. All of us stand before God in the Scriptures. If we obey God, we stand right with God and we'll be in heaven together. So racial distinctions were taken out of the way. Jew and Gentile were pretty strong differences between them. Wouldn't have anything to do with each other. Now, verse 16 goes on in Ephesians 2, and might reconcile them both in one body. Now, then what's the body? Well, Ephesians chapter 1 says the body is the church. Colossians 1 says the church is the body. Well, turns the formula around. There's a logical reason for that, but we won't get into that. But basically it says they're both identical. They're the same thing. So we might reconcile. So the reconciliation occurs on equal terms. To reconcile is to bring them back on equal terms. And so they're reconciled. How did they reconcile? Because they were together until Sinai. Jew and Gentile were. Abraham and his family were until Mount Sinai, were under the Patriarchal Law. They're separated then by the law of Moses. At the cross, the law of Moses is done away. We see this. Now then the reconciliation occurs. He doesn't tell us it occurs at the cross, but he tells us it occurs because of the cross. And he came and preached peace to you that are far off, you Gentiles, and peace to them that are nigh, that's the Jews. For through him, through Jesus, we both have our access in one Spirit unto the Father. So now we have access to God who is our Father. Now God is depicted as a loving Father, caring for, providing for his children. So it's a beautiful thought when we think of God being our Father. No other religion has God as their Father. Okay, none of your pagan religions have that. Muslims don't have it. Okay? So right here we see a very interesting, very, very fruitful thought, very pleasant to think of a loving Father. The passage does not apply to the Patriarchal Law. It's dealing with the law of Moses, when it ended. It doesn't tell us one thing about when the Patriarchal Law ended. That's a mistake that people reason that it ended there because of this passage, but the passage is not talking about Patriarchal Law. So right here, then, we have to look elsewhere to see when it ended. Now let's look at Deuteronomy 5, 1 through 3. We'll see something about the law of Moses. It was given only to the Jews. It was not given to others. It had separated Jew and Gentile, see? It had been a middle wall of partition. And Moses called unto all Israel. Now, this is Deuteronomy. This Deuteronomy, duad is second or two, nomos is law. So it's the second law giving. Why a second law giving? Well, they wandered 40 years in the wilderness because of their sin. And all the old people died off. Everybody over 20 except Joshua and Caleb, and I think their wives, they all died. And even Moses and Aaron didn't get to go in. So right here now, they come to the land again, and so he gives to all these people that have been young people, and now gives it again. So this is the second giving of the law. So he elaborates on it again. He preaches on it again. Someone says, Marion, you preached on baptism before. Yes, I preached 2 or 3, 4 or 5 different sermons, maybe 100 different sermons over the time I preached. But they'll be somewhat different because they'll use different passages and so forth. Well, right here, he goes again through the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. Deca is 10, logos is sayings, 10 sayings, 10 words, sayings, the commandments. And Moses called unto all Israel, and said unto them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the ordinances which I speak unto your ears this day, that ye may learn them and observe to do them. You people, you young people that have now gotten older, you were 1 year old, now you're 41. They were 10 years old, now you're 50. So these people need to hear it again. And of course, all the young people need to hear it too. That's 10, 11, 12-year-old kids as well. And so he says, I am going to give this to you again. You speak in your ears this day, you may learn them and observe to do them. So you hear, learn, and observe. Jehovah your God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Now Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai, the region where Sinai is. So he made that covenant with us at that time. Jehovah made not this covenant. Now notice, he did not make this covenant with our fathers. This covenant was not made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, our fathers. It wasn't made with them. So who was it made with? He says, but with us. Even us, who are all of us here alive this day. So that covenant was made with us. It was made with those who came out of Egypt, those who passed through the Red Sea. The covenant was then made with them and not with their fathers. If their fathers died before they passed through the Red Sea, they were under the Patriarchal Law. If they were faithful under it, I believe they'll be in heaven. So right here now, we see it laid out. The law of Moses, the Ten Commandments included. In this context, he elaborates on the Ten Commandments, and then he goes through more of the law in the following verses. So he says, this was given to us, not to our fathers. So the Ten Commandments weren't given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It wasn't given to the 12 patriarchs, the sons of Jacob. So who was it given to? Those who passed through the Red Sea and all of their descendants, the children of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, of course. So if the patriarchs didn't have it, what did they have? They had the Patriarchal Law. That's what we're saying here. That's what we've been teaching. So all of us here alive today. So the law of Moses, the law that was a middle wall of partition that was taken out of the way by the cross, that law was only given to the Jews. So when he said that law is taken out of the way, it's only the law to the Jews that was taken out of the way at that time. But let's look further. Deuteronomy 5, verses 4 through 22, he's referring to the law of Moses. We see that, and we follow in the following verses even after that. He elaborates on it even more. So I won't go back and read all of those for you, but you can read it for yourself. The Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, is given in two passages in the Scriptures, Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20. The law given at Sinai was not even for the fathers of the children of Israel. It wasn't even for their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jehovah made not this covenant with our fathers. Didn't make it with our fathers. Now you say, well, it was all right for them to murder, steal, or kill? No, because the Patriarchal Law said those were wrong too. See? They had a law, but it wasn't the Ten Commandments. One of the Ten Commandments of the 10 was never given to anybody but the Jews, and that's to honor the Sabbath day. Okay? So that was never given to anybody but the Jews. So God, Jehovah, made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us here, all of us here alive today. Look further. We must look elsewhere to determine when the Patriarchal Law ended. We know it ended. But when did it end? So let's look in Daniel now, and we'll see right here. Daniel prophesied that Messiah, and the King James has the word Messiah. The American Standard has the word anointed. Now, the word Messiah is Hebrew for anointed. The word Christos is Christ. That's the word for anointed. And those two words are equated twice in the book of John. So we know they're equal words, and of course, quotes from the Old Testament and the New translated Messiah Hebrew as Christos or Christ or anointed in the New Testament. Daniel prophesied that Messiah or the Christ would make his covenant, that is the New Testament, with the Jews for 7 years. Daniel 9:24. Now let's read this passage. The Hebrews the word 7 here, and this is 70 weeks, it's translated that way, but the word week here is not the normal word for week. Now, what we have here is we have a word that just means 7. Now, I listened to tapes of a man that taught at Oklahoma Christian College when I was taking Greek there, and listened to tapes, and he preached up here. Hugo McCord, some of you know who I'm talking about, and he knew Hebrew quite well. He taught Hebrew, and I listened to him on Daniel, and he says literally this is translated 70 of them. That would be a good translation of it. 70 of them. I wrote that down and listened to it carefully on tapes, listening to him. 70 of them. Now, where do the 7s come in? Well, we have 7 days in the week, don't we? 7 days. There's nothing in the planetary phenomenon, the moon cycles or anything like that we get a 7-day week. We get that from the Bible. Okay. But the Jews had Sabbath year cycles. We measure our time in centuries and decades. Decades, deca meaning 10-year cycles. Centuries, and that's from Latin, or 100. So centuries, 100-year cycles, and 10-year cycles. And of course, the 10 fits in. 10-year cycles will make a century. So that's how we measure. That's how we view time in English. We in the United States. Most of the modern world views time that way, but the Jews didn't. They went in 7-year cycles called Sabbath years, and then every 7th Sabbath year, 49th year, the year after the year of Jubilee, the 50th year, that was special. So they went 7-year cycles, 7 years, and they repeated things over and over on a 7-year cycle, not a 10-year cycle. So right here, 70 7-year cycles. That's 490 years. Now, when we put this into our context here and measure it all out and see the events he lays out here for us, we're not going to do that. We don't have time. But he brings us up to the personal ministry of Jesus, and it's 7 more years to the end of it. So it's very interesting now. We got a period here. 70 weeks are decreed unto thy people. Thy people would be the Jews. Look in the beginning of verse 1 of chapter 9 of Daniel. You see he's talking about Israel, the Jews. And so he said 70 weeks, 70 of them, 70 year, 100, be 490 years, are decreed unto thy people and upon thy holy city, it'll be Jerusalem, to finish transgression, to make an end of sins, and make reconciliation for iniquity. These 3 terms here are the terms that were used when they sent out the scapegoat. And all 3 of those terms were used. And Jesus, the scapegoat, typified Jesus in his crucifixion. And to bring in everlasting righteousness, so Jesus brought in everlasting righteousness. The book of Romans has about half of the time the word righteousness found in the New Testament is found in Romans. It's all about righteousness, the book of Romans is. And to bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up vision and prophecy, that is, to fulfill visions and prophecies, and to anoint the most holy. Now, we don't know if the most holy is the temple, the new temple, the church, or it's Jesus himself. But right here is another question. Know, therefore, and discern that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the anointed one, Messiah, King James Version, the prince, shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. Well, 7 and 62, it brings us up to the personal ministry of Christ. It shall be built again with street and moat, even in troublous times. Now, he's talking about rebuilding the temple, but the temple wasn't rebuilt after that time. It's talking about the new temple, the church. The church is the temple of God. We see this in 4 different passages in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Corinthians 6, 2 Corinthians 6, and Ephesians 2. And all 4 of those chapters deal with this as the church being the temple. And so it is then during in troublous times. Messiah is cut off. Now let's see this in the next verse here. And after the 62 weeks, shall the anointed one be cut off, and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince that shall come, now this is a different prince. This will be Titus, whose father is the emperor at that time, Vespasian. That shall come shall destroy the city. That's destroying the city of Jerusalem. And the end and the sanctuary. So the temple was destroyed at that time in AD 70. And he's prophesying of what was going to come. Whenever they crucified Jesus, it became certain that their city was going to be destroyed. That was it. That was final straw. It was set in stone at that point. It wasn't any way out of it. They had crucified him and his innocence, and so they were going to be destroyed. Shall come and shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end shall be with the flood. And even of the end shall be war, desolations are determined. That's Jerusalem destroyed. Now, look at verse 27. Back to Messiah. And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, for 1 7-year cycle. And in the midst of the week, that'd be 3.5 years, half of 7, 3.5, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. Now, wait a second. They kept offering sacrifices, but they were vain. They were not according to God's law anymore. If the law of Moses ceased at the cross, all the sacrifices they offered between the cross and the AD 70 were worthless. They didn't do any good. So they ceased. He, by his sacrifice, said no more sacrifices are needed. You don't need the blood of bulls and goats anymore. You got the blood of Christ. So now he says, and the sacrifice and oblation shall cease, and upon the wing of abomination shall come one that maketh desolate, and even unto the full end, and that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. So wrath is going to be poured out upon the children of Israel for their crucifixion of Jesus and rejection of him as their king. So now then, in the midst of the week, 3.5 years, personal ministry was 3.5 years, he's crucified, sacrifices cease. That is, they cease to be of any value and of any effect. This is the evident meaning of Matthew 15:24. But he answered and said, I will not send, was not sent, but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus, in his preaching, he made a covenant for a 7-year period. 3.5 years into it, he's crucified. He is making his covenant for 3.5 more years after that. So his apostles go out making as his ambassadors, 2 Corinthians, his ambassadors, they go out and make his covenant with the Jews. They only preached to Jews for the first 3.5 years after Pentecost. Then they began to preach to Gentiles in Acts 10. So right here, let's go back to Matthew 15:24. But he answered and said, I was not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So I was only sent to the Jews. Now, that doesn't mean he is not going to save Gentiles. In his ministry, he was making a covenant for 7 years with the Jews. Middle of that ministry, middle of that 7-year period, he's crucified. His disciples continued, the apostles continued to make that covenant for 3.5 more years. Acts 10 occurs 3.5 years later, and it begins to now bring in Gentiles. That's what I'm claiming we're seeing here. Now look further. This is why Jesus limited the preaching under the limited commission, where he sent out the men under the limited commission in Matthew 10 to the Jews only, because he's making a covenant with the Jews. Now there's good reasons for it. We're not going to take the time to show it, but I'll make a quick 2 points right here, right quick. The Jews were better suited because they had the law of Moses. They were better able. Faithful Jews were ready because they had a good moral base and they had the knowledge of the law of Moses, the fulfilled prophecies of Jesus. And so they were better suited to be ministers and so forth spreading the gospel to the world. Faithful Jews would have been the right people to do it. Unfaithful Jews wouldn't, of course, but faithful Jews would. And so also there was still prejudice. Even in Acts chapter 10, there was still prejudice on the part of the Apostle Peter, racial prejudice. And had they brought Gentiles in right up front, Jesus preached to them too, the Jews, many of them would not have accepted his message. They needed time to get this wrong thinking out of their minds. It takes time to change our way of thinking. Attitude adjustments don't occur overnight. You don't hit somebody in the head with a hammer and adjust their attitude. They have to decide it and work on it in their minds. So I believe those are two good reasons why he only gave it to the Jews first. And then they should have been, if the whole nation of Israel had been converted, they could have spread the gospel so easily to the whole world. But you see, they weren't. That's a shame. It's a terrible shame that they weren't. But these 12, now the limited commission, Jesus sent forth and charged them, saying, go not into the way, any way of the Gentiles, and enter not in any city of the Samaritans. So the Samaritans were not in it, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now I do have a problem here with this. With this passage here, right here, the Samaritans, don't go to them. It might be that the 3.5 years ended with Acts 8 when the Samaritans were brought in. That's a possibility. And that Acts 10 was a little bit later. So that's two possibilities. I don't know that we can be certain. It could be when the Samaritans were brought in Acts 8 because of this verse here. But go rather the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay. Messiah continued to make his covenant with the Jews for 3.5 more years after he was crucified. When the covenant of Messiah began to be preached to Gentiles, those under the Patriarchal Law, Messiah began to make his covenant with non-Jews. I think it was Acts 10. But Acts chapter 8, I think, was kind of a transition. But right here, we see this occurred. And so he began to preach to them. In Acts chapter 10, 11, and 15, give an account of this event. From this, I draw the conclusion that Acts 10 occurred 3.5 years after Acts 2. Now, it is possible that I'm wrong on this, that Acts 8 occurred 3.5 years later, and that it's the Samaritans who came in. Again, it's not critical to us anyhow, because we're way past that time, so all of the Gentiles are part of the covenant. So right here we see God brought them in over time. Acts 10 is also discussed in Acts 11, 1 through 18, Acts 15, verses 7 through 11. So if you're studying Acts 10, you need to put those other two passages with it. Now, this is a summary of my lesson this morning. All mankind was under the Patriarchal Law from Eden to Sinai, from creation to Sinai. At Sinai, the children of Israel ceased being under the Patriarchal Law, began to be under the law of Moses. The Gentiles continued under the Patriarchal Law until Acts 10, possibly Acts 8, the Samaritans. 3.5 years after Pentecost, Acts 2. After Sinai, the children of Israel were under the law of Moses until the Lord died on the cross. And when he died, they were not under it any longer. When the Lord died on the cross, children of Israel were under the law of Christ. They were responsible for it, the New Testament. I believe this explains so many things for us. The Lord began making his covenant with the children of Israel when he began his personal ministry. So then the preaching of Jesus was making of that covenant. And we'll lay this out a little bit more as we develop it. The Lord's personal ministry lasted 3.5 years. That's pretty well given. The apostles and early church preached exclusively to the children of Israel for 3.5 years until Acts 10, or possibly Acts 8. After Acts 10, or possibly after Acts 8, all mankind is now under the law of Christ. I still think it's Acts 10, under the New Testament. We, all races now, are together in the same kingdom. The whole world. It's a different kind of kingdom. Quickly, the law of Moses was a theocracy. It was a law, a civil law with a religious law mixed in. It was a national law, only for a nation. The Patriarchal Law was a family law, family worship, family law. Each family had it given to them. Christianity is a universal law for all mankind. For all mankind. It's not to a family, not to a nation, it's to everybody in the whole world. There's your difference. The New Testament teaches we must hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized, be added to the Lord's church, to be forgiven of sins, and to become part of that family. If you're a subject, we're going to sing an invitation song at this time. We not come as we stand and sing.